Welcome to this lesson of the Polgar Chess University. Today, I'll tell you about the queen, the most powerful piece on the chessboard. I'll tell you about its strengths, that is, to attack primarily, and the dangers it may get into, that you want to avoid. Also, I'll tell you about its role in the opening and how different it is in the middle game and in the endgame. Let's get started with our first example, when white is in a situation to create a very powerful attack real quick. If we look at the position, at first it seems that it's roughly equal, or even it's black who may have chances to win thanks to the far advanced pawn that's highlighted with green right now on a3. Materially speaking, the position is completely balanced. But it is white's turn, and time is the essence. The queen is a very quick piece. It's a long-range piece. It can get from one side of the board to another real quick. And here, the queen has an aid, the rook on h3. Together, the rook and the queen can create a deadly attack. And the move is, hopefully while I was talking about the position, you figured out the right move for white. It is queen to h5. Now, the queen together with the rook are both pressuring, attacking the pawn on h7 to capture, and regardless of black's move, the next move will be queen captures pawn, and it's checkmate. Black is helpless. This was a perfect example to see how powerful an attack can be with a queen. Let's see a similar example in the following position. In the position we see on the board right now, it seems that black is the one ahead because black has an extra knight for only a pawn. Black, with his last move, moving the queen to g5, black has offered a trade of queens. Considering that white is behind in material, this exchange of queens, just out of principle, is out of question, even if white would not have a much better, in fact, winning move. So now you know it should not be the trade of queens, but what should be the correct move? Where should the white queen move? Again, the cooperation is between the white queen and the white rook. The rook on the 7th rank is really powerful because it's attacking all across the 7th rank. The correct move here is queen c7, doubling up on the 7th rank and creating an immediate checkmate threat with the queen moving to g7. The only reasonable way black can try to defend that threat is by moving the queen to h6, getting ready to answer the queen check on g7 by the black queen capturing the white queen. But white has another move that's much better, in fact, and that is moving the queen to f7 check, forcing the black king to the corner, and then white, by capturing the rook, does not only just win a rook, but really also checkmates in the following move. In both of these examples, we saw how the queen with a long move all of a sudden can create a deadly checkmate threat. Let's see the next example for the same theme. The position we see right now doesn't have too many pieces, but black is the one ahead a pawn. Again, just like in the previous example, black is offering an exchange of queens if the white queen would capture the black queen the black knight is ready to recapture, and as we know, exchanges help the side that's ahead in material. Going back to our initial position, let's look for a better move. Here, the cooperation is between white's bishop on b2 and again the queen. Remember this idea when there is a long diagonal, the longest diagonal on the board, where the bishop is at right now. And there is a weakening on black's side by moving the pawn from g7 to g6. That can create a major weakness along the squares near the black king. In this case, the correct move is moving the queen to f6 on the same diagonal with the white bishop. Now there is a deadly threat by checkmating on g7 or h8. It is important because if it were only one of them, the one on g7, the black knight could protect the g7 square, but not both. Now queen h8 would result in a checkmate. Couple of more things that I would like to point out in this position is that having, for example, the queen and the bishop in reversed order, the white queen being where the white bishop is and the bishop where the queen is, would of course not result the same threat. Another thing I'd like to point out that bringing the queen to c3, again to the long diagonal, creating the same threats, would not be good because it would give black the opportunity to exchange the queens. Also, in addition to that choice, black could block the threat by moving the pawn up. Of course, I would prefer trading queens because black is a pawn ahead. Let's move on to the next position, where black has major material advantage. Black has 2 rooks, while white has none. White only has a knight in return, and a couple of pawns. Nevertheless, white has a winning attack. All these positions try to demonstrate how powerful of a piece a queen is, and to show when or how it can be used most effectively. The queen is the strongest attacking piece because it can make very quick moves from one side of the board to another, and also it can attack a lot of squares at the same time. It can take away a good number of squares from the opponent's king to escape to. In this case, it's pretty clear that the collaboration should be between white's knight on g5 and the queen. Try to use your imagination for a moment. Try to imagine where would you like to see the white queen. Hopefully, you came to the right answer, and that is you would like to see your queen on the highlighted by green square h7. If the white queen were there, that would be checkmate. Now the only question is, what's the best way to get there? There are a number of squares from where the white queen can try to attempt to go there. For example, queen c2 is one of them. Now the threat is clear. Queen to h7. The black king has no escape, and neither can the black rook from f8 move to give space for the black king to escape. Neither would help if the black pawn would play f6, because the white knight is controlling the potential escape square on f7, and the checkmate would follow anyway by playing queen h7. So let's go back. Let's say white does try queen c2. What should black do? Well, black's simplest and best defense now is to play g6 and block the white queen's route to the checkmating square. White would be in real trouble in this position because of the major material advantage that black already has. So, the correct move is not queen c2, neither queen d3 for the same reason that we discussed after queen c2, but the correct move is queen h5, threatening checkmate again on h7. It does not ultimately matter from where does the queen go there as long as it gets there. The main point is to make sure it does get there. So in this case, black is helpless and checkmate is unavoidable on the following move. Let's move on to our next position, where the queen's aid is a tiny little pawn. And remember this pawn formation on the king's side. It's very typical that black tries to castle sometime early or in the middle of the game, and the black king would be where it is right now on g8 and the rook on f8. This is a typical castling position. Also, the black pawns on f7, g6, h7 are very typical. What you need to also remember, the little white pawn on h6. So in this position, the white queen has a very powerful move. But first, try to again envision where would you like to see your queen if it would be a flying queen that you could put anywhere on the chessboard. Where would be that square that you would like to see that queen? Well, it is the g7 square. That's where the pawn from h6 would be protecting it, and therefore it would be checkmate. So it's very important to use your imagination and creativity to have a dream, because you can only get there if you at least know where you want to get to. So again, let's see what's the best way to get to that square. Obviously, the white queen would need to get somewhere along this diagonal. There are two choices in trying to get there, but which is the better one? Let's try queen a1, which has a very clear threat of checkmating on g7. But that is not quite the right solution because it gives black an option to block the diagonal and stop the checkmate threat. The correct move, on the other hand, is moving the queen to f6. And now black has no real defense against the threat. Black can delay the checkmate by giving a check or two, but essentially the checkmate is undefendable. And let's move on to the next position. In this endgame, black has an extra knight, but again, thanks to the fact that the black king is not so safe, and the white queen in one move can get right near black's king. White has a decisive attack. Here, the correct move is moving the queen to f7, checking black's king. Black only has one choice, moving to h8, out of the check. And now, with the help of white's knight on f5, white can checkmate by playing queen to g7. Game over for black. Let's move on to the next example, when again the heroes are the white queen and rook, working together real efficiently. If you look at the position, black has just moved his queen to b5 in hopes that because of the threat of checkmate by queen takes b2 and the offer to exchange queens, white will choose avoiding getting checkmated and rather exchange the queens, which will certainly help black's case as black has the material advantage. But white can do better. Try to think for a moment and figure out what is the correct move here for white. As so often, when you have options to make forceful moves, you should always check them, see if they work, see if they lead to some decisive advantage. A check in itself does not mean it's a good move. Nevertheless, you should check it out, see if it's checkmate or if it can lead to a very quick checkmate, which is the case here. White moves the queen to e8, forcing black's king to the open h file. And that's the key point here, that white does not have a pawn on h2, which would block the h file, and neither does black. Therefore, the white rook could simply move to the corner to h1, again attacking black's king, and the only move to delay the end is to block the check, which of course would be immediately captured, and the game would be over, checkmate. Let's change the subject a little bit and look at other situations when the queen can be used for different purpose. Here is a queen endgame where there are only the queens and 4 pawns on each side. Black, with his last move, queen to c2, attacked white's pawn on a4. Black also has a passed pawn on the e file, but white's pawn needs less moves to reach the promotion square than black's. The key idea in this position is that after white advances the passed pawn on the a file, and if black would try to stop that pawn or attack that pawn, thanks to the fact that the white queen is on b7, controlling the 3 critical squares a6, a7, and a8, the white pawn is unstoppable. The pawn just keeps marching up because it cannot be captured as the white queen is defending it. And in the following 2 moves, the pawn would just simply advance 1 by 1 and get promoted to a queen. Going back to the starting position, if we'll try to promote black's pawn, we'll find that white's pawn is much faster, and it arrived already to a queen, while the black pawn needs 2 more moves, and in the meantime black is busy getting out of a check, so it's no doubt that black will lose. Now let's look at some other kind of queen endgames, and to show you how powerful queens can be. One of the big dangers in queen endgames is that the king may be checked all the time. That is, the king cannot get out of the constant checks of the queen, which could result the game in a draw by perpetual checks. Let's see an example of that right here. In this position, if it were white to move, the simplest way to win would be to give a check with the white queen on g5, which would attack black's queen at the same time, and so to say, force black to exchange the queens. And without the queens on the board, and just the 2 kings with white having 3 extra pawns, the win would be no doubt. secured for white. But in this case, it is black's turn, and black can force a draw by constantly checking white's king. After queen d1 check, the white king can try to escape by going to f2, and then black should not get greedy and capture the pawn on g4 for the same reason as earlier. That would allow the queen check on g5, forcing the exchange of the queens, and even though white only has 2 extra pawns now, it's more than enough to win the game. Therefore, after the first check on d1 and the king moving to f2, the black queen simply should keep giving the checks along the d file, and since white has no piece that could possibly block those checks, after the position is being repeated 3 times, the same exact position being repeated 3 times, black can claim a draw. Even in a position like this, it's better not to capture the pawn on g4, despite that it would be with a check. Just keep giving the checks, whether on d2 or e2, either one will do the job. The white king has no escape from all the checks that the black queen is about to give. Let's see a bit more complex version of the same idea. In this position that we see on the board, white seems to have a completely winning position, being 2 pawns up, and in addition, the a7 pawn being just 1 square away from promotion. However, it is black's turn in this position, and black can force a draw by perpetual checks. The correct check is to check white's king on d1. Now, if the white king moves out of the check, the draw is real easy by checking on g4, and whether the king goes to f1 or the king goes to the corner, the checks will just keep coming, and after we reach this position the 3rd time, the rule is before you make the move for the 3rd time that would result in a repetition of moves, you would claim a draw. So let's get back for a moment after the first check on d1. What if the white queen blocks the check? Well, it's gonna be the same story. The queen still goes to g4 to check. And when the white queen blocks again, the queen goes back again to d1, not leaving white any other choice but moving back the queen. Queen g4. So how about if now the king comes to the corner? Now, black has to be careful. There are 2 choices of checks. One here on e4, which is not the right one, because it would give white the option to block the check with the pawn, and black would run out of checks. The correct check is going to f3. And after queen g2, again to d1. As you can notice, the checks keep coming along the same diagonal, and white is helpless against the perpetual checks. A nice escape for black in a seemingly lost position. And now let's talk about situations when the queen gets in real danger. In this position, it's white's turn, and the black queen, as you can see, is surrounded by all white pieces. That's always a bad sign. That's a sign to look out for danger. And this is one of the typical situations when the white rook would come and attack black's queen, and the black queen is trapped. The best black can do is give itself up for one of white's rooks. Nevertheless, that would be a major material loss. As we know, the queen is worth 9 points versus the rook only 5. Let's see another example when the black queen gets in trouble. This position, as we can tell, has been arisen just after a few moves, about 5 or 6 moves into the opening. And by the way, that's an important message. In the beginning of the game, don't get your queen involved. You need to involve your minor pieces first. Develop your bishops, your knights, put your king in safety by castling, and usually only consider moving with your queen after that. In this case, black did not follow that basic opening principle and moved his queen out prematurely. White here has a way to attack black's queen in a way that it will be trapped. Try to figure out the move for white. Yes, it is. Bishop to g5. And if you look carefully, black cannot save his queen. The best he can do is give it up for either white's bishop or knight. And one more example on the same theme. Again, the black queen is out where it shouldn't be, and if you look carefully, it has no free square to move to. All white needs to do is attack the queen. There are several ways to attack it. Attacking it with a knight is not quite the answer because the queen could escape to h5. But there is a much better way to attack the queen, that is, with the pawn to b4. And again, the black queen is lost. All these last 3 examples were trying to demonstrate why not to get the queen out early in the game, or why not to get a queen in a position where it's surrounded by all enemy pieces. And finally, let's see a basic example of how the queen should be handled in the opening. In the beginning moves, we should try to control the center, put a pawn or two in one of the center squares, and develop our knights. Both white and black are trying to do just that in a different way. These are the basic opening moves of the Pirc defense. As you can see, white has developed the 2 knights, the 2 bishops, and have castled. Black is on his way doing just that, developed his bishop, one of the knights, and castled. And now, black just developed the 2nd knight. And the typical way to develop the queen in the opening is just like one move, so the 2 rooks are connected, and they can move in the following moves to the center files, getting ready for the opening of those files. Well, I hope you learned a bit about the queen, how it should be used, when is it more effective, and what are the dangers that you should avoid. Thank you for listening, and hope you'll be back next week. Until then, so long.